You know how sometimes you just want to dive headfirst into a topic, absorb a ton of information really efficiently, and come away feeling like you actually get it?
Yeah, cut through the noise.
Exactly. That's what we're all about here. And today, you, our listener, have pointed us toward a fascinating and pretty complex area, the historicity of Jesus.
Right. And specifically, the methods people use to even try and figure that out. Huge historical claims.
You've sent in a great range of sources, really diverse stuff, and we're ready to get into it.
Absolutely. We've got material delving into the real nitty-gritty of historical analysis, some explorations of logical frameworks, even journeys into ancient mythology. It's quite a collection.
It really is. Our goal here is to distill it down, highlight what's significant,
Yeah, give you the core takeaways.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We're going to be doing a deep dive into the work of Dr. Richard Carrier. He's a name that, well, it often comes up when this topic is discussed.
For sure. Especially regarding mythicism.
Right. And specifically, we're going to focus on his use of Bayesian logic. Now, that might sound a bit technical, maybe a little intimidating.
It can't sound that way.
But stick with us. It's actually a really interesting way of approaching historical questions, particularly when it comes to the figure of Jesus. Your sources lay out both Carrier's approach and some of the criticisms he has of more traditional historical methods.
And as always, the mission of this deep dive is to give you a real understanding of the core issues without you having to wade through all the original material yourself. We want to see how a rigorous, evidence-based approach, grounded in logic, can help us assess the probability, really, of historical claims within these intricate narratives.
Expect some surprising comparisons, maybe some challenges to conventional wisdom, and hopefully those satisfying aha moments we know you're looking for.
Definitely aiming for those.
And to be our expert guide through this intellectual terrain, we have someone who can take all these different pieces, the logic, the history, the myths, and synthesize them into a clear and insightful picture. So let's dive in.
Let's do it.
All right, so jumping straight into the material you sent, one of the first things we noticed was a recurring phrase, Bayes theorem, B-A-S-E, in reference to Dr. Carrier's work. Now, you flagged that, and it's an important point to clarify right away.
Yes, it seems Bayes' theorem might be a slight misunderstanding or maybe just casual phrasing in some of the sources. Given the context, the comparisons of probabilities of evidence under different theories, the explicit mentions of prior probability, it's overwhelmingly clear that Dr. Carrier is applying Bayes' theorem, B-A-Y-E-S.
Okay, so it's Bayes. Got it. That makes more sense with the way it's being discussed, the whole probability thing. So, in essence, what is the core of this Bayesian logic as Carrier uses it for historical claims?
Well, at its heart, Bayesian logic, as he explains it, is about comparing how likely a particular piece of evidence is under one explanation, compared to how likely it is under a different explanation.
Oh, okay, like theory A versus theory B.
Exactly. And crucially, this comparison takes into account what's called the prior probability, which is, simply put, how likely each of those explanations, theory A and theory B, seemed to be before you even looked at the new evidence, based on, our existing knowledge or general background expectations.
So it's about weighing different possibilities based on the evidence and our initial sense of what's plausible to begin with. I can see how that might resonate if you have a background in, say, engineering or science that focus on probabilities and likelihoods.
Precisely. And one of your sources notes that Carrier presents this not just as some complex mathematical tool, but as a fundamental way of thinking logically about narrative arguments, about stories. He lays out this methodology in his book as a way to bring a more rigorous logical framework to the often quite subjective field of historical analysis.
Okay, so Carrier has this Bayesian way of thinking, this logical method to weigh probabilities, but the sources also make it really clear he's quite critical of the historical methods that were already being used, the traditional ones.
Right. Oh, yeah, putting it mildly. According to his research, which you included in your sources, studies have concluded that these traditional historical methods for evaluating narratives are, quote, very flawed. And in his opinion, they should essentially be stopped.
Wow. Stopped. That's a strong indictment. So what are some of these specific, very flawed methods that he takes issue with? Let's get into the details from your sources.
Okay, one method he critiques pretty heavily is the argument from embarrassment.
Argument from embarrassment, right. The idea that if something in the story is potentially embarrassing for the main figure, it's probably true.
Exactly. Because why would the followers invent something that makes their hero look bad?
Yeah, that sounds logical on the surface.
It does seem intuitive at first glance. However, Carrier challenges this with a really insightful example.
Yeah.
The Baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist.
Okay. How does that work?
Well, Mark's gospel includes it, and you could argue Mark included it to elevate Jesus by linking him to the popular prophet John. But then you look at John's gospel omits the baptism entirely, possibly because later Christians found it theologically problematic, like, why would the Son of God need baptism, especially from someone else?
Oh, okay. So it became embarrassing later.
Right. Carrier argues that while the omission in John might suggest embarrassment later on, the inclusion in Mark doesn't automatically make it a historical fact. Mark might have included it to serve his own narrative goals at the time. The inconsistency between the Gospels themselves shows how unreliable his method can be as proof of historicity.
So just because something might seem embarrassing or become embarrassing later doesn't guarantee it actually happened way back when.
Exactly. Its initial appearance might have served a different purpose entirely. It's not a straightforward path to historical fact.
Interesting. Very nuanced. Okay, what's another method Carrier finds problematic?
Another one is the removal of supernatural elements, often referred to as desmythologization.
Right, I've definitely heard of that approach. Peel back all the miracles and divine stuff to find the real historical person underneath.
That's the idea. But Carrier counters that if this were a valid historical method, you could apply it to virtually any mythological figure. His go-to example is often Hercules.
Hercules? How so?
Well, you could strip away all the fantastical elements of his labors, the Hydra, the Nemean lion, all that, and what would you be left with? Not much concrete evidence that a specific historical strongman named Hercules actually existed and did those things in some non-supernatural way.
Good point. You just end up with nothing provable.
Pretty much. He also points out that even the external sources often cited for Jesus, like the Roman historian Tacitus or the Jewish historian Josephus, might actually be describing a more mythical figure to begin with, the figure Christians were talking about, not necessarily the mundane historical person they'd independently investigated.
So simply subtracting the miracles doesn't magically reveal a verifiable historical core.
Exactly. It doesn't automatically lead you to a historical individual. The premise is flawed.
That makes a lot of sense when you put it like that. Now, what about the use of those external sources themselves, like Josephus and Tacitus? They're often presented as pretty strong independent evidence for Jesus existing.
They are indeed frequently used that way as independent corroboration. However, Carrier argues, based on textual analysis and scholarship, that many of the key passages within these sources that mention Jesus, or even John the Baptist for that matter, are likely late Christian interpolations.
Interpolations, meaning they were added in later by Christian scribes, not part of the original text?
Precisely. They weren't written by Josephus or Tacitus originally. Consider the passage in Josephus about John the Baptist. It includes a specific detail stating that John's baptism wasn't for the remission of sins.
Okay. Why is that significant?
Well, Carrier suggests this is a likely interpolation because that particular theological nuance, the exact purpose of baptism, would have been far more relevant and debated within a Christian context than it would have been to Josephus or his intended Jewish readership at the time. The fact that this detail seems tailored to address a later Christian theological discussion raises serious doubts about the authenticity of that whole section. It looks like something added to clarify a point for believers.
Wow. So these sources we often think of as solid, independent pillars might actually have been edited, let's say, by interested parties later on.
That's the strong possibility Carrier raises. It means we have to be much more critical when evaluating those passages.
That really changes how you interpret them. Okay, and what's the last flawed method from the sources that Carrier points out?
That would be the non-critical acceptance of attributed texts, particularly focusing on the Pauline epistles, the letters attributed to Paul.
Right. Now, aren't some of Paul's letters generally considered authentic by most scholars?
Yes, that's true. There's a consensus around several of them being genuinely from Paul. The issue Carrier raises, though, and that's highlighted in one of your sources, concerns potential interpolations within these generally accepted texts.
So like adding specific verses or passages into an otherwise authentic letter.
Exactly. The prime example given is from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, specifically verse 16. This passage appears to refer very clearly to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which happened in 70 A.D.
Okay. And the problem is...
The problem is that the widely accepted dating for Paul's death is before 70 A.D. He likely died in the mid-60s. So how could he be writing about an event that hadn't happened yet?
Yeah, that's a direct contradiction.
It is. Now, some scholars try to reinterpret the passage or argue Paul lived longer, but the most straightforward reading suggests it was written after the temple's destruction. Furthermore, analysis of the surrounding verses, like 14 and 15, also points to stylistic and content differences compared to Paul's undisputed writings. This leads many critical scholars to conclude that this section is likely a later addition, inserted into Paul's original letter.
So even within texts considered largely authentic, we need to be super careful and critically examine specific passages, looking for inconsistencies or things that don't fit.
Absolutely. You can't just accept the entire attributed text wholesale without scrutiny.
Okay, so Carrier is building a pretty compelling case here, or at least raising serious questions, that these long-standing historical methods have some significant weaknesses. Now, shifting gears slightly, one of the things you often hear in discussions about the historical Jesus is the idea of a scholarly consensus. Most scholars agree. What's Carrier's take on that, according to the YouTube transcript you sent?
Right. Carrier directly addresses this claim of a scholarly consensus favoring historicity. He acknowledges that there's a strong tendency within academia, a kind of pressure almost, to want the debate about Jesus' historicity to be considered settled, or just to ignore the question altogether.
So basically treat it as a done deal.
Pretty much. But he argues strongly that a debate is indeed ongoing, even if it doesn't always receive mainstream attention or get discussed openly in all departments.
So it's not this universally agreed upon fact that Jesus definitely existed as a historical figure.
Not according to Carrier and the scholars he cites. He mentions his own list, which he terms the list of historians who take mythicism seriously. He states that this list includes over 40 experts. These were professors with relevant PhDs in history, classics, religious studies, and so on.
Okay, over 40 experts. And what's their position?
Well, he says roughly a third of them are actual doubters, people who think the probability of a historical Jesus is 50-50 at best, maybe even lower. The remaining two-thirds, while not necessarily mythicists themselves, agree that mythicism is a legitimate scholarly hypothesis that needs to be discussed and properly evaluated, not just dismissed out of hand.
So a significant number questioning it and others saying the question itself is valid.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he makes another striking point, that the last dedicated book-length scholarly work specifically arguing for the historicity of Jesus, rather than just assuming it as a starting point, was published over 100 years ago.
Over a century. Wow, that's quite a claim. Does that mean no one's defended it since?
Not quite. Arguments appear in articles or chapters, but he's talking about a comprehensive, monograph-length defense from the ground up. His point is that historicity is often assumed now, not argued for in detail in the same way.
And the transcript also touches on potential influences within the field itself, right? Possible biases.
Yes, Carrier raises the point, and it's a sensitive one, that a significant number of researchers in the field of New Testament studies also have personal religious affiliations. For example, many are also pastors, priests, or hold other positions within churches.
Okay, and the implication is?
He suggests that this personal religious commitment could potentially create an inclination, conscious or unconscious, towards supporting the historicity of Jesus. It's harder to question the foundation of your own faith. He even mentions discussions about how, in some academic contracts at religiously affiliated institutions, scholars might face limitations or pressures regarding questioning historicity.
So institutional factors could play a role too.
Potentially. It raises important questions about potential influences on research outcomes and the overall openness of the academic discussion. He draws a parallel, saying, imagine the study of Hercules was dominated by scholars who were also devout priests in a modern Hercules cult. It might be harder for alternative perspectives, like mythicism, to gain traction or be taken seriously.
That's a provocative comparison. So Carrier's really pushing back hard on this notion of a settled consensus. He's arguing there's an active debate involving qualified scholars and also highlighting potential systemic factors that might be influencing the dominant view.
That's a fair summary of his position as presented in the sources, yes.
Okay, now let's shift our focus a bit because this is where things get really, really interesting, I thought. One of the more surprising areas that Carrier delves into, based on your sources, is the idea of pre-Christian mythological parallels.
Yes, this is often a central part of the mythicist case. Carrier explores the possibility that the story of Jesus shares notable similarities with much earlier myths.
Is he saying Jesus is just a copy of older myths?
His argument, as presented, isn't necessarily about direct, wholesale copying in every single detail. It's more nuanced. It's about the likely influence of shared cultural archetypes, or the borrowing and adaptation of existing narrative patterns and motifs that were already floating around in the ancient world.
Okay, borrowing and adapting. And one figure in particular kept appearing in the sources when this was discussed, Inanna. Can you tell us about that connection?
Right, Inanna. She was a very important goddess in ancient Mesopotamian mythology, Sumerian, Akkadian. We have texts about her that date all the way back to the 3rd millennium BC, so definitively pre-Christian by a huge margin.
Okay, very old. And Carrier points out parallels between her story and Jesus's.
Yes, some truly remarkable parallels. According to the sources discussing Carrier's work, Inanna descends into the underworld.
Okay.
She dies there. And this is a very specific and striking detail. She is described as being literally nailed up on a post or a hook.
Wait, nailed up.
That's the description cited, yes. Yeah. Then, incredibly, after 3 days, her messengers arrive. They revive her using the food and water of life, and she rises from the dead and ascends back to heaven.
Hold on. Descent, death, nailed up, 3 days, resurrection, ascension. That's a lot of very specific overlap.
It's a striking constellation motifs, isn't it? Carrier argues that the probability of such a unique combination of seemingly unrelated similarities appearing entirely independently in two completely separate religious traditions, thousands of years apart, is extremely low. Statistically improbable, basically.
So he sees this as evidence of what? Influence, borrowing.
In his view, it strongly suggests a likelihood of cultural transmission, assimilation of ideas, referencing of known stories, conscious or unconscious borrowing in the formation of the later Jesus narrative. He also notes that the cult of Inanna, later known as Ishtar, persisted for many centuries, even into the Roman era, the time of Jesus. There's a significant center for her worship in the city of Tyre.
Tyre. That's mentioned in the Gospels, isn't it?
It is, and while Carrier acknowledges we might not have detailed texts from first-century Tyre explicitly outlining her mythology then, he raises a logical question. What do you think people were still teaching and believing about this prominent, long-standing goddess in a major port city at that time? It's unlikely those core stories just vanished.
That's a really thought-provoking point. It's hard to imagine those core elements, death, resurrection, ascension, just disappearing entirely from her cult. The sources also mention other figures that Carrier draws comparisons to, though maybe less detailed.
Yes, he briefly touches on parallels or borrowed elements from figures like Moses, Elijah, obvious influences within Judaism, but also figures from the wider Greco-Roman world like Odysseus, the god Dionysus, Romulus, the founder of Rome, who also ascended to heaven, and even Aesop.
Aesop, the fable guy.
Yeah, Aesop is mentioned in one source, likely referring to Aesop. Carrier apparently sees parallels between Aesop as a kind of trickster figure, sometimes challenging norms, and certain aspects of how Jesus is portrayed in the Gospels, particularly in his more unconventional or challenging actions and teachings, the witty comebacks, outsmarting opponents.
Interesting. So the broader point is...
The broader point is that many of the foundational story elements, the narrative building blocks found in the Jesus narrative, the dying and rising God, the miracle worker, the sage, the figure who ascends to heaven, these weren't unique to Christianity. They were already present in various forms in the cultural and mythological landscape of the ancient Mediterranean and Near East.
So it's not necessarily about saying the gospel writers sat down with a checklist of Inanna's story and copied it directly, but more about drawing from a shared cultural pool of existing ideas, themes, and character archetypes when constructing their narrative about Jesus.
Precisely. It's about understanding the cultural context and the available narrative resources at the time.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, one final area your sources touch on is the question of Jesus as the Messiah. This is obviously central to Christianity. Did he truly fit the messianic expectations described in the Hebrew Bible, according to these sources?
Well, this is a really complex question. As one of your sources points out, it's inherently challenging to answer definitively for a historical Jesus, since we lack direct, unambiguous evidence of his own views on his messiahship. We mostly have the Gospels' portrayal.
And how do the Gospels portray him in that context?
It's clear that the Gospel writers go to great lengths to connect Jesus to the prophecies and expectations found in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. They construct genealogies, point to fulfilled prophecies, frame his actions in messianic terms.
So they definitely try to make the case he was the Messiah.
Absolutely. Yet at the same time, there are aspects of Jesus' life and teachings as portrayed that seem to diverge from some of the prevailing messianic expectations of the time. For example, the dominant expectation was often for a Davidic king, a military leader who would overthrow Roman rule and restore Israel's sovereignty. Jesus, initially at least, is presented more as a preacher, a healer, a teacher.
Right, not a warrior king in the Gospels. But there's also the idea of him returning as a warrior, isn't there, in Revelation?
Exactly. Christian eschatology, the theology of end times, includes the concept of Jesus returning with power and judgment, leading armies, conquering evil, as depicted vividly in the book of Revelation. Carrier interprets this, in a way, as Jesus still fulfilling the role of a warrior Messiah, but with that more militant aspect of his messianic mission shifted to a future time, the apocalypse.
So the warrior part isn't abandoned, just postponed?
Kind of, yes. And interestingly, this idea of a future or overtly powerful messianic age wasn't entirely new. It had precedence in some pre-Christian Jewish texts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which also spoke of future cosmic battles and deliverance.
So the concept of the Messiah itself wasn't monolithic back then. There wasn't just one single job description everyone agreed on.
Precisely. That's a key point. There were diverse ideas floating around in Second Temple Judaism about what the Messiah would be or do, maybe a prophet like Moses, a conquering warrior king like David, a priestly figure, a spiritual redeemer, a social reformer, even an apocalyptic revolutionary figure. This variety of expectations allowed for different interpretations and potential fits. Someone could emphasize certain aspects and downplay others.
And the sources mention there's even a minority view among some scholars that the historical Jesus was actually an armed revolutionary.
Yes, that view exists, arguing that the Gospels perhaps downplayed or disguised a more political, revolutionary aspect of Jesus' movement. However, it remains a minority interpretation as the Gospels themselves largely seem to present a different picture, emphasizing peace or spiritual kingship.
Which brings us to some of those more pacifistic-sounding teachings attributed to Jesus, like render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, or love your enemies. How do those fit into a messianic framework, especially in Roman-occupied Judea?
Well, some scholars, as noted in one of your sources, interpret these sayings as potentially serving a pragmatic purpose, encouraging Jewish submission, or at least non-confrontation, towards Roman rule. This could be seen as aligning with a more non-violent, perhaps spiritual, movement aiming to survive and grow within the Roman Empire.
Kind of like Paul's later instructions.
Exactly. It aligns quite well with the emphasis on peace and submission to governing authorities that you find clearly stated in Paul's letters, particularly in Romans 13. This suggests an effort, whether by Jesus or his later followers like Paul, to build a movement that could navigate the realities of Roman occupation by adopting a less overtly confrontational political stance.
Right. This has truly been a deep dive into some really complex and definitely fascinating material. Let's try and bring it all together with some key takeaways from this exploration.
Okay. So in summary, what we've seen from your sources is that Dr. Richard Carrier advocates for a really rigorous, logical approach to evaluating historical narratives. Specifically regarding the historicity of Jesus, he champions using the principles of Bayes' theorem.
Right. That probabilistic thinking.
Exactly. And this methodology involves a critical re-examination of traditional historical methods, things like the argument from embarrassment or desmythologization, arguing they're flawed. It requires carefully considering the probability of the evidence we have under different explanatory frameworks like historicity versus mythicism.
And it also brings in that exploration of potential influences from pre-existing mythological traditions, like the Inanna parallels.
Yes, looking at the broader cultural context. The overall effect, as we've explored, is that this approach really reveals the significant complexities and, importantly, the ongoing debates surrounding the historical Jesus. It demonstrates how applying a probabilistic framework challenges many of the often unquestioned assumptions in this field.
It definitely moves way beyond a simple yes or no. So what does this all mean for you, our listener, who sent these sources in?
Well, perhaps the most provocative thought to take away from this deep dive is this. How could these principles of Bayesian logic, thinking about probability, weighing evidence for competing explanations, considering prior knowledge, how could that be applied to evaluating other historical claims, or even the information, the narratives you encounter in your daily life?
That's a great question, not just for ancient history, but for news, for social media, for any claim someone makes. Thinking about how likely different explanations are and what the evidence really supports.
Exactly. Consider the likelihood of different explanations and the actual strength of the evidence when you're presented with various narratives, especially conflicting ones. It's a powerful thinking tool.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sending in these incredibly thought-provoking sources and sparking this fascinating exploration. We've definitely covered a lot of ground.
We have. And as you said, it feels like we've only scratched the surface in some ways. There are many more avenues and specific arguments we could delve into if this topic has grabbed your attention.
For sure. But for now, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Indeed. Thank you.